November 20th, 1943. 09:10 hours. Betio Island, Tarawa Atoll, Central Pacific. Private First Class James Russell crouched in the cargo hold of landing vehicle, tracked number 47, as it ground across the coral reef toward the beach. The LVT's tracks, fitted with cleated oblique shoes, clawed over razor-sharp coral that had already stopped 30 Higgins boats dead in the water 500 yards offshore. Russell could hear the metallic scrape of coral against the vehicle's thin steel hull, barely 3 millimeters thick. Above the grinding, another sound, the hammer-like reports of Japanese machine guns firing at the exposed Marines, wading through chest-deep water behind them. The LVT carried 18 Marines toward the most heavily fortified atoll the United States had yet attempted to assault in the Pacific War. Russell's battalion, the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion, possessed only 79 LVT-1s and 50 LVT-2s for the entire landing operation. Every other Marine would have to wade. The LVT-1 could manage 12 miles per hour on land, 7 in water. It had no armor. Its original purpose had been cargo transport from ship to shore. No one had designed it for assault, yet here it was, crawling over coral reef walls that should have been submerged under 5 feet of water. Instead, the ocean sat at 3 feet deep. The tide had not risen. A phenomenon called an apogean neap tide, occurring only twice in 1943, had arrived on the exact morning of the assault. One former British Army officer, Major Frank Holland, who had lived on Tarawa for 15 years, had warned American planners about these dodging tides. He had pleaded, nearly in tears during briefings at Ifate, for the operation to be delayed. November 20th would see inadequate water over the reef. The planners had dismissed his warnings. Planning was too far advanced to alter. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Now Marines were paying the price. Behind Russell's LVT, men from companies that had boarded the standard LCVP Higgins boats found themselves trapped. The boats drew 4 feet of water. They needed 5 feet minimum for navigation. When they struck the reef, coxswains had poured fuel to their engines, but the craft would not move. Metal hulls rasped against coral. Japanese machine gun fire rang against the plating with increasing tempo. Marines had abandoned their landing craft and begun wading, 800 yards to shore, rifles held overhead, water to their chests. Some found deeper channels and drowned, pulled under by the weight of ammunition, belts and equipment. Private Russell did not yet know that of the 5,000 Marines who would attempt to land on Betio that morning, 1,500 would be killed or wounded by day's end. He did not know that of the 125 LVTs committed to the assault, only 35 would remain operational by nightfall. The vehicle's mechanical reliability, never exceptional, would collapse under combat conditions. Tracks would freeze. Roller bearings would jam with sand and coral fragments. But in this moment, as LVT-47 climbed over the reef wall, Russell understood one essential fact. His vehicle could go where the Higgins boats could not. The LVT was saving his life. The story of how an amphibious cargo tractor became an assault vehicle at Tarawa begins not with military planning, but with civilian rescue operations in the Florida Everglades. In 1935, a retired engineer named Donald Roebling developed a vehicle he called the Alligator, designed to operate in swampy terrain inaccessible to both automobiles and boats. The Alligator featured an aluminum hull propelled by 2 rows of tracks fitted with cleats that gripped soft ground, while also serving as paddles in water. It could travel 25 miles per hour on land, 2 miles per hour when afloat. In 1937, Roebling published photographs of his improved design in Life magazine. A Marine Corps general, visiting Life's offices on unrelated business, saw the photographs and immediately recognized their military application. The Marine Corps had been developing amphibious warfare doctrine since the end of the First World War, anticipating a future conflict in the Pacific that would require assaults across coral reefs and shallow waters. They had been searching for a vehicle that could solve precisely this problem. By January 1940, Roebling had completed a military specification version called the Crocodile. It featured greater speed, improved durability, and the ability to climb a 55-degree slope. The vehicle was, in Roebling's design, unsinkable, even when flooded. The Navy Bureau of Ships contracted for 200 machines to be built from steel rather than aluminum. Food Machinery Corporation in Dunedin, Florida, received the production contract. The first LVT-1 rolled off the assembly line in July 1941. The Marine Corps initially classified the LVT as a logistics vehicle. It would ferry supplies from transport ships to beaches, then return with wounded. The vehicle was not armoured. It carried no weapons. Its thin steel hull offered virtually no protection against small arms fire. The cargo hold, measuring 21 feet 6 inches by 9 feet 10 inches, could carry 4,500 pounds of equipment or 24 combat-equipped Marines. The hold was divided into watertight compartments, Marines boarded by climbing over the sides into the open top. The 1st and 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalions formed in late 1941 and early 1942. Most Marines assigned to these units had never seen a tracked vehicle before. Few knew how to maintain them. The LVT's peculiar steering mechanism tended to freeze if steady pressure was applied to the steering lever instead of a sequence of pulls and releases. Tracks performed well on sand but poorly on hard surfaces. Roller bearings required constant maintenance. Early models suffered frequent breakdowns. The LVTs saw their first operational use at Guadalcanal in August 1942, exclusively as supply vehicles. They shuttled ammunition, rations, and water from ships offshore to marine positions inland. They evacuated wounded back to hospital ships. The vehicles proved their versatility in this role. Marines praised their capability to traverse terrain impassable to wheeled vehicles, but no one had yet used them for assault. By November 1943, when planning for Operation Galvanic began, American strategists understood that Tarawa represented a fundamentally different challenge than Guadalcanal. Betio Island measured approximately 2 miles long and 800 yards at its widest point. The island was flat coral, offering no natural cover. The Japanese had transformed it into what would become the most heavily fortified atoll in the Pacific. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibasaki commanded the garrison. He had reportedly stated that the United States could not take Tarawa with 1 million men in 100 years. Intelligence estimates counted 4,500 Japanese defenders. The actual number included approximately 1,500 men of the Sasebo 7th Special Naval Landing Force, elite naval infantry equivalent to Marines. Another 1,100 men belonged to the 3rd Special Base Force, also combat-capable. 1,200 Korean forced laborers had worked for a year constructing fortifications. The defenses included 100 reinforced concrete pillboxes, an extensive trench system, coastal defense guns, anti-aircraft batteries, heavy and light machine guns, and light tanks. The beaches were ringed with barbed wire and mines. The natural obstacle that would determine the battle's character was the coral reef surrounding Betio. The reef extended 500 to 800 yards offshore, averaging 50 yards in width. At high tide, under normal conditions, the reef should be covered with 5 feet of water. The standard LCVP Higgins boat, which had proven itself in every previous Pacific landing, drew 4 feet of water. Planners calculated that 5 feet of depth would provide adequate clearance, but certain individuals with direct knowledge of Tarawa's waters expressed concern. Marine planners consulted the so-called Tarawa Legion, a group of mariners who had guided ships through the Gilbert Islands for years. Some Legion members spoke of dodging tides, periods when the tidal range became abnormally small. A New Zealand reserve officer, Major Frank Holland, had lived on Tarawa for 15 years. He understood the water conditions intimately. During planning conferences at Pearl Harbor, Holland had initially supported predictions of 4 feet of water at invasion hour, but at final rehearsals at Efate in the New Hebrides, Holland reversed his position dramatically. When he learned that the landing was scheduled during a neap tide period, he became agitated. Witnesses reported he was nearly in tears, shaking his fist, emphasizing repeatedly that at landing time there would be no more than 3 feet of water over the reef. The United States Coast and Geodetic Survey Office, maintained that dodging tides did not occur at Tarawa with any predictability. Their harmonic analysis of tidal patterns showed no evidence of the regular anomalies that appeared at places like Port Adelaide, Australia, where dodging tides were a known phenomenon. He understood something the tide tables did not capture. At Tarawa, the rise of water during neaps could be very small, sometimes less than 1 foot in 6 hours. When combined with certain oceanic conditions, the water level could appear nearly static for extended periods. Holland's warnings were not heeded. Operational planners believed the schedule could not be altered. The massive fleet was already assembled. The element of surprise would be lost by delay. Admiral Richmond Kelly Turner, commanding the amphibious force, and Major General Holland Smith, commanding the 5th Amphibious Corps, made the decision to proceed. The assault would take place on November 20th as planned. The 2nd Marine Division, which would conduct the assault, had been withdrawn to New Zealand after Guadalcanal for rest and recuperation. Men had recovered from malaria and other tropical illnesses. Replacements had filled out the ranks. Training had emphasized the new amphibious tactics that would be tested at Tarawa. The Marines understood they were attacking a heavily defended island in daylight with no possibility of surprise. Japanese defenders had watched American preparations for months. There would be no easy landing. On November 19th, the vast American fleet arrived off Tarawa. It included battleships, aircraft carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and a massive supply train. The naval force supporting Operation Galvanic was the largest yet assembled for a Pacific amphibious operation. The 2nd Marine Division, commanded by Major General Julian Smith, numbered approximately 18,000 men. They would assault Betio's northern beaches, designated Red 1, Red 2, Red 3, and Green Beach. That evening, General Smith issued a message to his Marines. A great offensive to destroy the enemy in the Central Pacific has begun. The men spent a restless night in sweltering troop compartments below decks, each dealing with pre-assault anxieties in his own way. Some wrote letters, some checked and rechecked equipment, some slept, most thought about what the morning would bring. The operational plan called for a sustained naval bombardment beginning at dawn, followed by airstrikes, then the landing of assault waves at 0900 hours. The planners calculated that the tide would be rising through the morning. By the time the first waves reached the reef, there would be adequate water for the Higgins boats to pass over. Heavier craft, bringing tanks and artillery, would follow at noon when the tide reached its peak. The 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion would lead the assault. Their 79 LVT-1s and 50 LVT-2s would carry the initial waves directly to the beach. These vehicles, originally designed for logistics, had been field-modified with additional weapons. Many now mounted a 50-caliber Browning machine gun forward and 30-caliber machine guns aft. Some had received 9 mm of armor plate bolted to the cab. These modifications added weight, reducing the vehicle's already slow water speed from 7 miles per hour to something closer to 5. The Marines understood that 129 LVTs could not carry the entire assault force. Most men would have to transfer from the LVTs to Higgins boats for subsequent waves. The LVTs would make their runs to the beach, discharge their Marines, then return to ferry more men and supplies. The plan assumed the Higgins boats could follow once the tide rose sufficiently. No one in the planning staff had seriously considered what would happen if the tide did not rise. Major Holland's warnings had been noted, then dismissed. The mathematical certainty of tide tables outweighed the experiential knowledge of one British officer who had sailed these waters for 15 years. This was the American way of warfare in 1943. Systematic, technical, confident in the superiority of logistics and firepower. What could not be measured and calculated tended to be discounted. The Marines boarding their landing craft in the pre-dawn darkness of November 20th did not know that the ocean would fail them that morning. They did not know they were about to test a principle that would shape American amphibious doctrine for the remainder of the war and beyond. When standard landing craft cannot reach the shore, tracked amphibious vehicles must carry the assault. The LVT, designed as a cargo hauler, was about to become the difference between possible victory and certain catastrophe, and that difference would be measured in the ability of steel tracks to climb over coral walls that Higgins boats could not cross. 09:10 hours. The first LVTs crossed the line of departure and began their run toward Betio's northern beaches. Colonel David Shoup, commanding officer of Combat Team 2, rode in an LVT assigned to Red Beach 2. Shoup was 38 years old, an Indiana native who had spent 15 years in the Marine Corps without seeing combat. 10 days earlier, he had been serving as the division's operations and training officer when the regimental commander suffered a breakdown. Major General Julian Smith had promoted Shoup to colonel and given him command of the assault regiment. Now Shoup was leading 5,000 Marines toward the most heavily fortified beach any American force had yet attempted to assault. Time magazine correspondent Robert Sherrod rode with the fifth wave, scheduled to land 31 minutes after hour. Sherrod had been covering the Pacific War since early 1942. He had observed Marines at Guadalcanal from a relatively safe distance. Tarawa would be different. From his position in the Higgins boat, Sherrod watched the naval bombardment reach what he would later describe as an unbelievable crescendo of thunder, smoke, and fire. Nearly 1,000 tons of aerial bombs had already struck Betio. Now, naval guns were adding 1,500 tons of shells. The volume of explosives falling on this tiny island exceeded anything yet attempted in the Pacific War. The Marines in Sherrod's boat possessed what he called calm confidence. More than half were Guadalcanal veterans. They had cleaned their rifles and sharpened their bayonets during the voyage north. They had studied aerial photographs and contour maps of Betio until they could recite beach designations and landmarks from memory. When Sherrod asked one Marine if he was afraid, the man had replied without hesitation, "Hell no, mister, I'm a Marine." The Corps had trained these men to believe they were the world's best fighting force. That belief was about to be tested against Japanese defenses, unlike anything they had encountered. The LVTs carrying the first 3 waves entered the lagoon through the narrow boat passage opposite Betio's center. Japanese coastal guns opened fire. Shells splashed near the transports, forcing them to shift to safer positions. Hour, originally scheduled for 08:30, was delayed. The assault waves circled in what had become broad daylight. There would be no surprise. At 09:10, 30 minutes late, the first LVTs began their final approach. The vehicles moved slowly through the water, their tracks churning at roughly 5 miles per hour. Marines crouched in the open cargo holds could see Japanese positions along the beach, concrete pillboxes, log-reinforced bunkers, machine gun emplacements. The defensive works appeared intact despite the bombardment. Smoke drifted across the island, but the structures themselves stood. The LVTs ground across the reef. Their tracks, fitted with cleated shoes, gripped the coral and climbed. This was the moment that would validate or invalidate the entire operational plan. If the vehicles could cross the reef and reach the beach, the assault had a chance. If they became stuck like the Higgins boats that would follow, the Marines would face the same deadly wade that intelligence officers had dismissed as unlikely. The vehicles crossed. One after another, the LVTs crawled over coral that lay just 3 feet below the surface. Japanese machine guns opened fire. Bullets clanged against the thin steel hulls. Some vehicles took hits that punctured fuel tanks or damaged steering mechanisms. But most continued forward. The tracks that Donald Roebling had designed for swamp navigation in Florida were carrying Marines across a Pacific coral reef under enemy fire. Colonel Shoup's LVT approached the long pier that jutted from Red Beach 2. Japanese fire intensified. An enemy shell exploded near the vehicle, and Shoup felt the concussive blast wash over him. The explosion left him severely shocked and suffering from what would develop into a serious leg wound. But Shoup remained conscious and functional. His vehicle continued toward shore. Not all LVTs made it. Japanese gunners concentrated fire on the approaching vehicles. Some LVTs burst into flames, others had their tracks shot away and became immobile. Marines jumped from disabled vehicles into the water and attempted to wade the remaining distance. But the vehicles that reached the beach delivered their Marines alive. The difference between riding an LVT and wading from a stranded Higgins boat was the difference between possible survival and near certain death. Behind the first waves, the assault plan began to collapse. The fourth, fifth, and sixth waves approached the reef in standard LCVP Higgins boats. These craft drew 4 feet of water. They needed 5 feet minimum for navigation. When they reached the reef and found only 3 feet of depth, the boats struck coral and stopped. Coxswains poured fuel to their engines. The craft did not move. Metal hulls scraped against razor-sharp coral. Japanese machine gun fire rang against the plating. Marines faced a choice: remain in the stalled boats under fire, or abandon the craft and wade. Most chose to wade. They climbed over the sides, dropped into chest-deep water, and began moving toward shore. The distance varied from 500 to 800 yards depending on location. Each Marine carried a rifle, ammunition, grenades, and full combat equipment. The weight alone made movement difficult. The coral beneath their feet was sharp enough to slice through. Boot soles. Some men found deeper channels and disappeared beneath the surface, pulled under by their equipment. Robert Sherrod watched from his Higgins boat as Marines transferred to smaller craft that could navigate closer to shore. An officer appeared alongside and said they needed help badly on the beach. Japanese shells began peppering the water. Major Howard Rice and 17 men scrambled into the small boat and headed for shore through mortar and automatic weapon fire. Sherrod's boat remained, circling, taking near misses. One Marine picked 6 pieces of shrapnel from his lap and stared at them. Another said, "Oh God, I'm scared. I've never been so scared in my life." 2 more boats passed, disabled, their crews abandoning them. Marines realized that this landing would be made, if at all, in the face of concentrated enemy machine gun fire. The Japanese defenders had survived the naval bombardment largely intact. They had built their defensive positions from reinforced concrete and logs buried deep in coral. The high explosive shells employed by the bombarding ships had detonated before penetrating these structures. The bombardment had destroyed communications equipment and killed men caught in the open, but it had not eliminated the bunkers and pillboxes. When the bombardment lifted, Japanese troops emerged and manned their weapons. They had excellent fields of fire across the reef and beaches. The Americans had created a killing ground for themselves. Colonel Shoup reached the beach and immediately understood the situation was desperate. Marines who had landed from the LVTs were pinned behind a low seawall that ran along the beach. Japanese fire from pillboxes and trenches prevented movement inland. More critically, the follow-on waves were not arriving. Shoup could see Marines wading through the lagoon, hundreds of them, moving in slow motion through chest-deep water, while machine gun fire swept across them. Bodies floated in the water. Wounded, men tried to keep moving but collapsed. The carefully planned assault waves had dissolved into individual acts of survival. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Shoup established a command post in a Japanese bunker near the pier. Despite his wounds and the shock from the shell explosion, he began organizing the defense of the tiny beachhead. Radio communications with the ships offshore were intermittent. The waterproofed radios that were supposed to function in these conditions had failed when Marines waded through salt water. Shoup had limited information about what was happening on the other beaches, but he could see Red Beach too clearly. It was chaos. The Marines who had reached shore represented perhaps half of those who had attempted to land. The other half were dead, wounded, or still trapped on the reef. Equipment losses were catastrophic. Many Marines who survived the wade had lost their rifles. Machine gun crews had abandoned their weapons when the guns became too heavy to carry through deep water. Flamethrower operators had ditched their tanks. The Marines on the beach had small arms and grenades. They had no heavy weapons, no radio contact with supporting arms, and limited ammunition. Yet Shoup did not consider withdrawal. His Medal of Honor citation would later describe how he fearlessly exposed himself to terrific and relentless artillery, machine gun, and rifle fire from hostile shore emplacements. How he rallied hesitant troops by his own inspiring heroism, how he assumed command of all landed troops and worked without rest under constant withering enemy fire. These phrases captured essential truth. Shoup understood that the Marines on Betio had no option except to advance. There was no safe place on the beach. The only path to survival led inland, through the Japanese defences. The LVTs that had delivered the first waves to shore now attempted to return to the reef to ferry more Marines and supplies. Of the 125 LVTs committed to the assault, mechanical failures were already mounting. Tracks froze, engines overheated, roller bearings jammed with coral fragments and sand. By day's end, only 35 LVTs would remain operational, but those 35, making repeated runs across the reef, would keep the assault alive. They ferried ammunition forward and wounded back. They transported Marines who would otherwise have had to wade. The LVT, designed as a cargo hauler, had become the critical link between the ships offshore and the Marines fighting on the beach. The afternoon of November 20th revealed the full dimensions of what the failed tide had created. Marines continued wading ashore throughout the day, but casualties mounted with each wave. Japanese gunners had zeroed their weapons on the approaches. Machine gun fire swept the lagoon in predetermined patterns. Mortars dropped shells among the wading men with methodical precision. The Marines kept coming because there was no alternative. Once committed to the wade, a man could not turn back. The only direction was forward, toward the beach, through fire. Robert Sherrod finally reached shore in late afternoon. What he witnessed would inform his book Tarawa, The Story of a Battle, published the following year. Sherrod described the beach as littered with bodies and debris. Marines who had made it ashore were pressed against the seawall, unable to advance. Japanese fire from positions just yards inland prevented any movement. The dead lay where they had fallen. The wounded crawled toward whatever cover they could find. Medical corpsmen worked in the open, treating casualties while under fire. Sherrod encountered Colonel Shoup at the command post. The colonel was directing the fight while standing in full view of Japanese positions. Shoup's leg wound had become infected. He was in considerable pain, but he continued to coordinate the scattered Marine units, assign objectives, and call for supporting fire when radio communications permitted. Sherrod would later write that Shoup was largely responsible for the final decisive defeat of the enemy. Without Shoup's leadership during those first critical hours, the assault might have failed completely. By evening of the first day, Marine casualties approached 1,500 killed and wounded. The 2nd Marine Division had committed approximately 5,000 men to the initial assault. Nearly 30% were casualties. This rate exceeded anything the Marines had experienced at Guadalcanal over 6 months of fighting. At Tarawa, it had taken 12 hours to reach 30% losses. The strategic significance of what had occurred was not immediately apparent to the men fighting on Betio. They understood they were in a desperate situation. They knew the landing had been more difficult than planned. But the broader implications, how this battle would reshape American amphibious doctrine, would only become clear in the weeks and months following. The LVTs had succeeded where conventional landing craft had failed. This was the inescapable lesson of November 20th. Every Marine who rode an LVT to the beach arrived alive, even if he was subsequently killed or wounded in the fighting ashore. Every Marine who waded from a stranded Higgins boat faced a gauntlet that killed or wounded substantial numbers before they ever reached the beach. The disparity was not subtle. It was obvious to every man who participated. Marine planners had always understood that LVTs could cross reefs that Higgins boats could not. But they had viewed the LVTs as cargo vehicles, not assault craft. The plan for Tarawa had allocated 129 LVTs to carry 3 assault waves, then assumed that subsequent waves would arrive in Higgins boats once the tide rose. The plan had failed because the tide did not rise. What should have been a calculated risk landing during a neap tide had become a near disaster because the Apogean neap tide was more extreme than predicted. Major Frank Holland's warnings, dismissed during planning, had proven accurate. There was not adequate water over the reef. Marines had paid for that miscalculation with their lives. The question now was whether American military planners would learn from the error or repeat it in future operations. The fighting on Betio continued through November 21st and 22nd. Marines gradually pushed inland, reducing Japanese positions one bunker at a time. The process was brutal and slow. Each pillbox had to be assaulted directly, usually with flamethrowers and demolition charges. Japanese defenders fought to the death. Very few surrendered. The battle devolved into close-quarters combat in trenches and fortifications across the tiny island. On the second night, Colonel Merritt Edson, the Division Chief of Staff and Medal of Honor recipient from Guadalcanal, came ashore and relieved Shoup of overall command. Shoup had been on his feet directing the fight for 36 hours while wounded. He resumed command of his 2nd Marines Regiment and continued the assault toward the eastern end of the island. The arrival of additional battalions and the gradual restoration of normal tidal conditions on November 22nd allowed tanks and artillery to reach the beach. With this support, Marines systematically destroyed the remaining Japanese defences. The debate over whether Tarawa had been worth its cost began before the battle ended. On the evening of November 21st, with fighting still raging in the centre of Betio, Major General Julian Smith sat in his command post aboard the USS Maryland and calculated casualties. The numbers horrified him. Over 1,000 Marines killed or wounded in 36 hours. The 2nd Marine Division, which had landed with approximately 18,000 men, had suffered losses, approaching 7%. Individual assault battalions had lost 60% or more of their strength. Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the 5th Fleet, visited Smith's command post that evening. Spruance asked whether the operation should continue or whether remaining Marines should be evacuated. Smith, exhausted and shaken by the casualties, nevertheless replied that withdrawal was impossible. The Marines ashore were too intermingled with Japanese defenders. There was no defensive perimeter from which an organized evacuation could occur. The only option was to continue the attack until Betio was secured. Spruance agreed. The assault would continue. By the evening of November 23rd, organized Japanese resistance had ceased. Small groups of defenders continued fighting from isolated positions, but the battle was effectively over. The final count revealed that of approximately 4,700 Japanese troops and Korean laborers on Betio, fewer than 200 had been captured. Nearly all Japanese combat troops had fought to the death. The Americans had suffered 997 Marines killed, 30 sailors killed, and over 2,000 wounded. These casualty figures, when reported to Washington and subsequently to the American press, generated immediate controversy. Time magazine's December 13, 1943 issue featured photographs from Tarawa that shocked the American public. The images showed dead Marines lying in the shallow water of the lagoon, their bodies drifting with the tide. Another photograph depicted a wrecked LVT on the beach, its cargo hold filled with dead Marines. These were not sanitized images of distant warfare. They were intimate, brutal documentation of what amphibious assault against prepared defenses actually looked like. The public reaction was intense. Newspapers across the United States questioned whether such casualties were acceptable for an island barely 2 miles long. Congressional representatives demanded answers from the Navy and Marine Corps. One senator called Tarawa a tragic and unnecessary mistake. Letters poured into the War Department from families demanding to know why their sons had died for a coral atoll most Americans had never heard of before November 20th. Robert Sherrod, whose eyewitness reporting had captured the horror of the assault, found himself in the peculiar position of defending the operation he had so graphically described. In articles written after returning from Tarawa, Sherrod argued that the battle, despite its casualties, represented a necessary and successful operation. American forces had demonstrated the ability to seize a heavily fortified atoll against determined opposition. The lessons learned at Tarawa would be applied to subsequent operations, potentially saving thousands of lives in future battles. The military establishment gradually rallied around this interpretation. Tarawa had been costly, but it had been necessary. The operation revealed critical weaknesses in American amphibious doctrine that could now be corrected. The LVT had proven itself essential. Better coordination between naval gunfire and ground forces was necessary. Longer bombardment periods were required. More thorough waterproofing of communications equipment was mandatory. These were painful lessons, but they were lessons that could only be learned through combat. By early 1944, as planning began for the assault on the Marshall Islands, the debate over Tarawa's value had largely subsided. The operation at Ro Namur in February 1944 would incorporate all the lessons from Tarawa. 350 LVTs and armoured LVTs would carry Marines to the beach. The pre-landing bombardment would last 2 days rather than 2 hours. Waterproof radios that actually worked in salt water would be issued to assault units. The legacy of Tarawa extended far beyond the immediate lessons of amphibious warfare. The battle represented a turning point in American understanding of what defeating Japan would require. Before Tarawa, there had been an assumption among both military planners and the general public that Japanese defenses could be overcome relatively easily through American material superiority. The Pacific War, this thinking suggested, would be won through industrial production and technological advantage. Japanese troops, frequently characterized in propaganda as inferior fighters, would collapse when confronted with American firepower. Tarawa demolished this comfortable delusion. The Japanese defenders at Betio had fought with extraordinary skill and determination. Their defensive preparations had been sophisticated and effective. They had inflicted casualties at rates comparable to the worst fighting of the First World War. The notion that American victory in the Pacific would be swift or cheap vanished in the coral sand of Betio Island. What replaced it was a more sober recognition that reaching Tokyo would require years of grinding combat and tens of thousands of American casualties. The LVT became the symbol of how American forces adapted to this reality. A vehicle originally designed for civilian rescue operations in the Florida swamps had become, through necessity and innovation, the critical weapon system that enabled amphibious assault in the Central Pacific. The evolution from cargo hauler to armored assault vehicle reflected the broader American capacity for improvisation and adaptation under combat conditions. Production of LVTs increased dramatically after Tarawa. Food Machinery Corporation expanded its production lines. Additional manufacturers received contracts. By mid-1944, American forces possessed thousands of LVTs of various types. The LVT-4, introduced in late 1944, featured a rear ramp that allowed Marines to exit from the back of the vehicle rather than climbing over the sides. This seemingly simple modification reduced casualties significantly during beach assaults. Armoured variants mounting 75mm howitzers provided direct fire support during landings. Every major amphibious operation after Tarawa employed LVTs as the primary assault vehicle. At Saipan in June 1944, 700 LVTs carried Marines across the reef. At Peleliu in September 1944, LVTs enabled Marines to bypass heavily defended beaches and land at less fortified points. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, LVTs delivered Marines to the beach through heavy surf that would have swamped conventional landing craft. At Okinawa in April 1945, over 1,000 LVTs participated in the largest amphibious assault of the Pacific War. The statistical record demonstrates the LVT's importance. From Tarawa through Okinawa, American forces conducted 14 major amphibious assaults against Japanese-held territory in the Central Pacific. These operations employed a total of approximately 8,000 LVT sorties. The vehicles delivered over 300,000 Marines and soldiers to contested beaches. They evacuated approximately 50,000 wounded. They transported millions of tons of ammunition, food, water, and equipment from ships offshore to forces inland. Without the LVT, none of these operations would have succeeded in the manner they did. The cost remained high. Approximately 2,000 LVTs were destroyed or disabled during combat operations between November 1943 and August 1945. Hundreds of coxswains and crew members were killed operating these vehicles. The LVT was never designed to be an armoured fighting vehicle. Its thin steel hull provided minimal protection. Marines riding in the cargo hold remained exposed to enemy fire. Yet the vehicle's ability to traverse coral reefs, navigate through surf, and climb over obstacles made it indispensable. The broader question of whether Tarawa itself had been necessary remained controversial for decades. Some historians argued that the atoll could have been bypassed, isolated, and left to wither. American forces advancing westward through the Marshall Islands and eventually to the Philippines could have rendered Tarawa strategically irrelevant without the cost of a direct assault. This argument gained traction in the immediate aftermath of the battle and resurfaced periodically in subsequent historical analyses. The counter-argument, advanced by military historians and supported by most senior commanders who fought in the Pacific, held that Tarawa had been both necessary and valuable. The Central Pacific Drive required forward bases for air and naval operations. Tarawa, once seized, provided anchorage for the fleet and airfields for bombers that supported subsequent operations. More importantly, Tarawa forced American planners to confront the realities of amphibious warfare against prepared defenses. The lessons learned saved lives at Kwajalein, Saipan, Guam, and beyond. If those lessons had not been learned at Tarawa, they would have been learned somewhere else, possibly at even greater cost. Private First Class James Russell, writing to his family from a military hospital in Hawaii where he was being treated for wounds received during subsequent combat operations, offered his own assessment. He wrote that Tarawa had been hell, but it had been necessary hell. The Marines who died there had bought knowledge with their lives. That knowledge had enabled other Marines to survive battles they would have otherwise lost. Russell believed this represented a fair exchange, though he admitted he might not have thought so while crossing the reef under fire on November 20th. The memorial Colonel David Shoup helped dedicate on Tarawa in 1968 bears inscriptions in both English and Japanese. The English reads, "To those who gave their lives in the Battle of Tarawa, November 1943. The Japanese inscription is similar. The memorial makes no distinction between American and Japanese dead. Both fought for their countries. Both died on a 2-mile coral atoll in the Central Pacific. The strategic importance of that island has long since faded. What remains is the memory of 76 hours during which courage and sacrifice determined the outcome of a battle that should have been impossible to win. The LVT that carried Private Russell across the reef on November 20th survived the battle. After the fighting ended, maintenance crews from the 2nd Amphibian Tractor Battalion conducted a detailed inspection of all remaining vehicles. LVT 47 had sustained 32 bullet strikes, 6 shell fragment impacts, and extensive mechanical damage to its right track assembly. The vehicle was classified as beyond economical repair and stripped for parts. Its hull was pushed into the lagoon, where it sank in 20 feet of water. It remains there today, one of dozens of wrecked vehicles scattered across the floor of Tarawa's lagoon, monuments to the small tracked vehicle that changed amphibious warfare and the men who drove it into battle. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.